delay? Okay, perfect. It's working now. Hi there. Thank you for staying with us, the last panel of the day. I hope you've enjoyed all of the thought-provoking conversations and blockchain, especially just then as well. We heard all of the use cases and all of the benefits of the technology from assessments point of view, but also from the security anti-fraud point of view. I am glad to be joined by such an illustrious panel today to sort of talk about, more generally about the state of the industry at the moment. You know, what's hot or not at the moment, what are the leading sort of technologies and themes that people are looking at, investing in and implementing, and also just talking about the challenges as well that we're all facing at the moment. The idea with this State of the Industry review is a new thing that we are installing at Capacity Media on the publishing side. So every year we will be rolling out and publishing a State of the Industry report. So there were surveys conducted with delegates earlier today. There will be more surveys conducted with respondents over the coming weeks. That in turn will be turned into a report, which we will be publishing and sharing with the industry. And that will include some insights from this panel as well. So first and foremost, I'd like to say thank you again for joining us. And if I could go down the panel, starting with Chris, just to briefly introduce yourself and explain a little bit about what your responsibilities are at AT&T, Chris. And just very briefly, what are the kind of big, maybe one or two key trends that you think are certainly worth kind of a big topic about?
Okay, Jason. Thank you. Chris Roy from AT&T. I'm responsible for our global wholesale solutions organization, which includes wholesale globally with the likes of other service providers. Also, I'm responsible for our affiliate organization, which is all of the wholly owned subsidiaries within our company, which has been an interesting jaunt with the recent acquisition of Warner Media, and we spend most of our time these days on where we invest most of our capital and where we collect most of our revenue on that capital, which I think we'll get into a little bit later, but primarily resides around the edge.
Hi, I'm Michael Wheeler. I head up the global internet backbone business for NTT. And I think before I do a quick introduction of what I do, I think we talked earlier about if we have a panel that starts around 5 o'clock, there should be cocktails in the back of the room. Anybody else show of hands up for that? Okay, so I figure I'd just bring that up. So. All right. Anyway, yeah, I head the backbone business for NTT, and I guess as far as trends go, I mean, I think the things that we would probably say are our biggest keys for us right now are just a little bit of what Chris mentioned, edge, but just the growth of internet traffic holistically. I think there's the edge side of that. There's certainly the intercontinental part of that as well, and managing that growth curve that is really not slowing down at all. If anything, it kind of is expanding exponentially. And along with that, I think comes network security, IoT, and the devices that we're seeing, the billions and billions of devices that are being utilized now, whether they're from a consumer perspective or a business perspective. That creates a different kind of challenge in relationship to network security and managing the kind of the potential challenges that come with having that much technology connected to the internet as well. So those are probably the two macro things I would point out.
Mm-hmm. Alexandre?
Yeah, Alexandre Pebereau, founder and CEO of IBASIS. Yeah, I noticed that when we are in London after tea time, gender diversity and diversity altogether becomes an option. Yeah, we at IBASIS, we do believe in industry trends. We're even launching new trends in the industry. We're a $1 billion company now. We serve 1,000 operators. We are created from, of course, the IBASIS you knew from the start, with the real-time communication patterns, voice over internet for the carriers. But since then, we've innovated in 4G diameter, the authentication of roamers, and more recently innovated in IoT with international connectivity. We are also consolidating SFR, the Royal KPN in the Netherlands, the ex-Orange Dominicana, and Portugal Telecom. We are in 20 countries, And for us, an industry trend, a new one, because those are, yours are very respectable, we follow them as well, but in the new ones, we have the consolidation one, you know, attracting funds in our industry and showing to investors that, you know, returns can be made when you are an independent carrier. I think that's what already has been demonstrated by CenturyLink, Zayo and JTT, and we are doing the same now in the voice and the mobile industry as an independent carrier, carving out and consolidating players.
And Kevin as well, from a slightly different perspective as well, but certainly a very important one, talking about the standardization work and APIs as well, and the LSA.
Yeah, so Kevin Vachon, I'm the COO of MEF. Been doing this for about 13 years now. And, you know, and my responsibility is to oversee the execution of all of our programs globally. And, you know, I'll start with a comment. You know, we're in this world of transformation. We all talk about digital transformation. The gentleman, I think from R3 on the previous panel said, you know, standards organizations move extremely slow. That's not always the case, because we don't move slow. And we've changed, and we're transforming. If we didn't transform, we couldn't be in this industry. So the way in which standards are created, for example, we often start with POCs now. We didn't do that before, they were paper specs. We've transformed our processes to make it much more agile. We're delivering software development kits instead of just paper specifications. So we've transformed, it's a work in progress, but we're certainly proud of being a much more agile, kind of modern day standards organization. Our focus, there's a couple key areas of focus, automation, which we're going to talk about. In particular, automation of, you know, inter-carrier transactions around services ordering with our LSO initiative. The one big topic that comes up over and over again that I have to mention is SD-WAN. And we're rapidly, you know, we've been known for the years as the guys that did the Ethernet stuff, the carrier Ethernet stuff. But we're rapidly being known for the organization that's driving out standardization in the SD-WAN space, and also automation of those transactions eventually. And you know, we think that's a pretty timely initiative, and there's certainly a desire to have that kind of structure and discipline brought to that industry.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, guys. A fairly recent statistic that just came out, Equinix have been doing their annual interconnection index, which I find really fascinating, actually, going through the statistics. Their latest report forecast that private connectivity at the edge will grow by 51% by each year and exceed a total bandwidth capacity of 13,300 terabits per second, and that's over the next 3 years. So that's huge. London actually itself is alone going to account for just over 1/3 of all of European traffic as well. So that's just a nice fact about London and where we are today. First of all, talking about that amount of demand and that bandwidth demand, that's a huge kind of opportunity and challenge, right? And staying ahead of, you know, that fast change and that pace is such a big talking point, and there are so many different parts to that. But if I could ask you guys to open up on that one, what is the impact of the changes in demand for whole services today, especially when we're looking at such more, you know, much more bandwidth intensive services? So I don't know if you want to take that one, Michael, perhaps first.
Sure. Yeah, so I think, so Equinix is their report. We tend to look quite a lot at the Cisco B&I report as well. I think they have a slightly different view of it also. The reality is that those reports themselves have changed and kind of matured quite a bit over the last few years, in particular, looking at how they quantify the traffic in different components of the overall network, not just kind of holistically. And it gives, I think, a little bit better view of that. And you know, looking at edge-specific traffic, looking at metro traffic, looking at continent-specific traffic. Those are all realities based upon the geography of where you are, and also whether it's consumer-driven, mobile-driven, or, you know, fixed line. So looking at some of the breakdowns of that gives you a little bit, I think, better crystallization of what that really is going to, what the impact is going to be, and kind of where the predictions are in relationship to growth in the future. But the bottom line is it's getting bigger, there's more of it, and then how are you going to handle it? That's kind of the in a nutshell, that's what you get to. And I think the big question is certainly there's the standard, you know, routers and optics and cards and all those things, and that's all part of the equation. But really, the other part of it is, and I know we're going to talk about automation, but really, how do you manage and run a network from an automated point of view? And I think that's really a key factor in that whole equation of how does this actually scale. And so on a global level, being able to programmatically manage devices all around the world is in an automated fashion. It's just so much more efficient than doing it on a kind of one-off, onesie-twosie basis. And I think that's the type of thing that we see as being pretty critical for the industry and for providers, all of us that have to take that kind of challenge on. But the applications themselves, we tend to be a little less driven by exactly what the application is, but just the scale and the volume of the traffic, as well as just the destination points. Any of the major large content companies, whether you're talking about social media, gaming, e-commerce, it doesn't really matter, have gotten further and further to the edge, to Chris's point, over the last 10, 15 years. So the edge has gotten bigger and broader just from a pure physical perspective, but obviously just the utilization of the edge has grown exponentially as well. But I mean, those are just really all the challenges that you kind of, I think, have to address when you're in this space and providing services at that level.
I would say hyper demand doesn't necessarily mean hyper resources. I think a lot of us are operating a little bit more with a little bit less, or a lot more with a little bit less these days. So to your point of automation, well taken. We're retrofitting automation for services that never had automation before. And going forward, we don't launch a thing without it, frankly. So I think that stretches the human capital beyond where we thought we could probably stretch it before, and gives a much better end user experience. Yeah, absolutely.
Kevin, on the automation play there, any words to add?
Yeah, a couple of comments. One is, if you look at the globalization that's going on, the growth of all of this international traffic, it kind of validates a couple of things that we've done over the years. Firstly, we've always had a tremendous, when we built the standards for Ethernet services, and we're now doing optical and IP and SD-WAN, all of those standards were always built with a multi-operator context in mind. We didn't build services that were just restricted to a single operator. So from a services standards, which are really important for transactions, for providers working together, you need standards. So that work is, that approach, I think, is very useful today. And when you look at the evolution of the overlay services like SD-WAN, essentially what MEF has got is a nice framework just of the services, where we've got these defined multi-operator underlay services, now defining the operator, or the overlay services, I should say. And I know at our board level, discussions with AT&T execs and others, there's a tremendous interest from an automation perspective of the interaction between the overlay and the underlay. Now that's a little bit of a future, but to be able to have that, for operators to leverage the underlay capabilities they have. Some of them are saying, I've got a global dynamic migration to a dynamic underlay to be able to support that sort of elasticity, not static, right? So I think the services standards that we've done, multi-operator in nature, different types of services, as well as our orchestration framework and the APIs, I think it's a nice kind of picture that's coming together.
Alexandre, do you have any words to add?
Yeah, really in line with that. I mean, that's exactly what this kind of event and what the Global Leader Forum is doing, is really to make sure that we harmonize between all operators and that all this technology is indeed interoperable. Then it comes to also as the next trend following that, the IoT, typically, because once you have all those devices, the next thing you want is to make sure that you can connect them automatically, indeed, and to make sure you can monitor that from wherever you are.
Okay. Excellent. Let's stick with the automation topic. So how are carriers actually incorporating necessary levels of automation to really provide next-gen services within their networks? And we mentioned SD-WAN, that came up, and that's certainly something as well that's sort of being installed a lot. Again, Kevin, lots of work going on the SD-WAN front in terms of those standards to really help carriers work with one another. Interoperability at every layer as well is such a huge, crucial point. It's something that came up very heavily at ITW as well when we were talking about at the fourth industrial kind of revolution panel, very much looking into kind of like this actually in terms of the state of the industry as well. So, I mean, how are you all respectively incorporating automation into your networks currently? What is the main focus? And how does SD-WAN play into that?
An example that I would use, Kevin had hand in with Colt and some of the custom APIs that we put in place. That looks like a press release and a lot of automation that took place at the same time. It actually was a 3-year proof of concept that was led by Kevin and executives of both companies. And I can tell you that the output on that is so positive that you're not quite sure what the limitations are. More of that with more carriers and frankly, kind of a governing body, for lack of a better term, with MEF was very helpful in that.
Yeah, the SD-WAN activities, automation activities on SD-WAN are still pretty early stage. There's not a lot of inter-carrier stuff going on yet. We're in the education process of making carriers aware of the standards for SD-WAN as so they evolve their SD-WAN services to align the standards. There's all sorts of value add you can produce above and beyond what the standardization. I think there's 2 discussions going on. Is obviously the APIs that we initially produced for inter-carrier transactions were for Ethernet services, but they will evolve to automation of broadband access loop provisioning, in AT&T, where you guys are buying so many of those loops, and it's not automated today, from what I know. And so that's a future point. We'll see some progress there in 2020. There's quite a bit of interest on the automation front within provider networks for SD-WAN. We have all of these vendors with different APIs and so on and so forth. A lot of the major providers are supporting quite a number of vendors. And so to be able to orchestrate services across multiple vendors within their own network is probably the shorter term focus. And then interoperability of SD-WAN and so on is still a topic of debate, and automation there is going to be a little longer out.
Just on that, in terms of looking on the challenges front, many of us are all entrenched in our own kind of ways of working. So when it does come to proofs of concept and collaboration and truly moving forwards, how do you think we're tackling that particular topic of being entrenched in our own processes? Because it's one of those things that it's never really spoken about, but it's always there, and it's something that will it change completely? Probably not. But where do we get to that point? And a lot of good work's been done on the MEF front with Kevin as well. And the GLF as well. Just talking about the blockchain initiative just before this panel, and also for the fraud report that's coming out as well at this event. How are we all opening up more in terms of collaboration in that sense? How are the respective companies doing that on this panel?
Industry-wide, I don't know a lot of industries that would get together like this and have the type of conversation. I think that's a good sign that we've spent the afternoon talking about interoperability and kind of thought leaders in the space. So there are, you talk about blockchain that kind of spans multiple industries. I'm sure they get to talk about that. I'm not sure there's an industry ahead of ours, frankly, when we start talking about interoperability.
I would agree. I think that, and particularly parts of our industry, when you think about the public internet and how RFCs work, how common routing protocols and announcing it has to occur for traffic to traverse one network to another. By design, it's intended to be interactive and interoperable. And I think some of the most current examples are some of the work that's been done around things like RPKI and some of those changes in regards to route announcements and validation. The Manners Initiative, the Internet Society has done is in a similar fashion. I think that goes even beyond just kind of interoperability, but really also protecting and providing security from a network point of view in regards to routing and announcements. So it still takes, a few groups to kind of agree on, I guess, on the initiative or the approach, build that momentum. But the reality is that, at least in that particular segment of our industry, it doesn't work if we don't, exchange traffic with each other in a direct way. You can't communicate if that's doesn't exist and isn't in place. So by default, it has to work. That doesn't necessarily mean everyone has to always agree on how it works, but it ultimately does have to work or it doesn't function for anyone. And I think that's actually, to Chris's point, a real kind of a testament to how well the industry can work together and collaborate when those things are really, truly needed.
Yeah, for us, it's not as important, but I think it takes us to the security subject, which is really the key of today, to make sure that when we communicate in a safe way.
Sure. So that, MEF got involved in this thing because of, if you think about a wholesale side, and you guys typically have 250 or 300 partners to deal with at any sort of layer of service, and it's tough to kind of establish some sort of de facto standards if that's what you're trying to do with that many players, right? So we were sort of the neutral third party that was logical. But, so we're kind of we have about 130 service provider companies involved. So we're like an aggregator of talent in this space. We kind of bring some active subset of that 130 together with staff and so on to try and get things done, right? And that's kind of what the role we're playing is, bringing everybody to the table. The challenge we have, it's the same thing that you can talk to any standards body on the same issue, is actually getting people to contribute. Everybody enjoys the fruits of the labor, so to speak. They like the product that we produce, but to actually get people to show up and drive business requirements and use cases and so on and so forth before you even get to development and so on, that's the big challenge we have. So that's a lot of what we're doing right now is one-to-one, preaching to our members, get your people involved, get your business people, get your operational people. And that's really the only thing that slows us down right now, frankly, is just trying to get the people driving the work from our member community.
So talking about the collaboration and from an industry point of view, I mentioned the GLF as well. So tomorrow morning's panel session is on the GLF fraud report that's just come out, and a lot of work's gone into that. It's the second annual one. It's got a lot of exposure from a national and international point of view. And just one snippet from it is that 80% of carriers at the moment within this report, and there'll be more detail tomorrow morning, see site fraudulent traffic management as a strategic or top priority for them currently. So talking about security and talking about anti-fraud and how we're arming ourselves in the fight to combat and mitigate fraud. What are your respective companies doing in this sphere? And where do you see it going? Anyone can pick that one up.
And you're the better person to respond. This is a voice-driven question for the most part.
Definitely, because we're connecting 1,000 operators on really fraud. I mean, that subject on the security stuff is just as increased as a priority to a level never seen before. I mean, we all thought that, because communication were coming more and more cheap, that fraud would disappear. And actually, it's exactly the contrary that happened. And now, I mean, at the GLF, it's the first theme, the first subject we are addressing. It's fraud. We spent an hour on that. It's the CEO himself. It was Daniel Kurgan so far at Telecommunications, and Christian Michaud, who is leading that group. But the fraud has become the most prominent subject we have to deal with. Now, once that is said, we put all our efforts into this security part, and what we see, and I think that in the US that has been quite developed, is the identification of the incoming call, and to show you before you pick up the call to make sure that the number who's calling you is an identified number with an history. And now the level of anti-fraud tools is at such a level of expertise that now you can be told in advance who is calling you. On that kind of predictability, that's really something that is completely new in the industry.
Michael, do you want to go on that? We spoke earlier, for example, as well about the sort of mitigating DDoS attacks as well, being quite a big player.
Yeah, I don't think those are fraud specific, but I think from a collaboration perspective around DDoS mitigation, about carriers communicating with each other either during attacks or certainly after attacks are over, and the lessons learned. And that's the platform that we've developed in the GLF for that particular initiative, I think, has been very good. And we have a security kind of breakout on Thursday here as part of Capacity Europe that will talk more about that. But I think it's not so much on the fraud side, but from a network security point of view, again, the strength of the internet, if you will, is the fact that all these networks are connected, but that's also creates the exposure and kind of the ability for it to be jeopardized as well. And so it's certainly important for every carrier who has any volume of traffic to have a way in which to not only address attacks, but to collaborate with the other people they're connected to address attacks and manage that. So from a security point of view, or network security point of view, that's certainly something that I think, there's still more work to do, but there's a lot of great teams in our various carrier organizations that are doing that work today, and we just want to continue to stay as focused on that as the bad guys are as focused on driving attacks across the networks.
Chris?
I was just floored to see where most of, I did a little research on our security, I was floored to see where most of our attacks come from. Gamers. Yeah, gamers, the root of all evil as far as I'm concerned, but my kids would disagree violently.
It's not Fortnite, the root of all evil?
Just in my mind. The truth is, I mean, we were kind of, you asked what our companies do, and we were kind of indoctrinated in it. It's kind of in our knitting. We've been securing a physical network for as long as I can remember, and a cyber network for as long as everyone else on stage. But I agree with Mike. I mean, I think that the real power is not what we all do individually, but what we all share, and how the industry becomes stronger as kind of an underlying best practice. As our best practices become kind of state of the art and industry standards, I think we become much stronger.
And I suppose on that, it's certainly something that's an ongoing kind of focus for everyone. But with the proliferation of connected devices, more IoT-enabled devices as well, just a huge plethora of access points for those attackers, those potential gamer attackers, those frustrated Fortnite players, whatever it may be. That changes the game a little bit, in the sense of us staying ahead. Because some of these devices are being pumped out and manufactured at such an alarmingly fast and cheap rate. That makes it even harder as well when we're looking at enhancing that security. Something that I'd like to ask Alexandre, Michael, and Chris specifically actually is something about consolidation and acquisition in the marketplace. Chris, you mentioned Warner Media at the beginning. Michael, from the 1st of October, there's been a lot going on at NTT with integrating all the different business units. And Alexandre, of course, as well, with the acquisitions that we've seen with IBASIS and the Altice businesses as well, forming, under the Tefane family. Where do you see the marketplace at the moment when it comes to consolidation? How much appetite is there at the moment? How much movement is there? Where do you see it going?
I think everything has its trend, and I think from a physical network perspective, we've seen quite a bit. And you would have to argue that that's probably over, but I would have probably argued that 5 years ago and would have been proven wrong. I think when you look at the edge and a lot of the veins of opportunity that exist in this market with regard to IoT, edge computing, I think that's still an evolving market, so the S-curve continues, for lack of a better term. But I think you move out of the physical backbone network and more into the application layer as we go forward.
Yeah, I agree. I think the propensity for it will vary a bit geographically. Like, for example, I would look at Latin America as a market where there's still a pretty good amount of consolidation opportunity in a number of ways in certain countries in particular. I think in the US, though, I would agree with what you said, Chris, and that there will still be more combinations. I also think that as the general economy is on an upswing, even if it's a gradual 2.5% upswing, you don't see as much consolidation opportunity in general. But there are a couple players in our industry that have been hit pretty hard recently in the markets, and if you aren't afraid of debt, they could be got for very cheap multiples in relationship to what was paid to build those companies over the last 10 years. So depending upon where I think the overall macroeconomy is, that can also drive opportunity. If that were to take a turn in the other direction, I think you'd see some acceleration, one in distressed assets, but then also the acquisition of those assets. And I think that would probably be the biggest catalyst to seeing more acquisition occur in my mind. But that, to your point, it ebbs and flows a bit. And I think that's probably, would be the big thing that would really change that, at least in the short term for Western Europe and the US, at least in particular, I would say. But I think in emerging markets, certainly Latin America, to some degree, I think Africa, there's some opportunity still that's very greenfield in regards to acquisition and combinations.
Yeah, I completely agree, man. You can still have consolidation both horizontally and vertically. If you just take the States, I had not realized, but you still have 186 operators in the States. So, of course, not the big ones, but you have room for consolidation. But that would be horizontal. Vertically, I think because now that we have a very strong network and safer, we can invest, and that's what we're doing, invest in platforms where you can develop aggregation of new services, and indeed, thanks to your acquisition, go much more quicker on the growth path with new services.
We don't play in the consolidation arena, but it's a dirty word for me because we're largely membership funded. So anytime I see another M&A transaction, it's an immediate loss of revenue for us. I really, I'd like to see, corporate breakups and all of this stuff going on, right? The only area I'd say we've had an impact there is that, and this is coming from some of the operators, whether it been mergers. It's been said that, so we certify both the service providers, the vendors, and also people. And we've had some really good examples where organizations merged, like back when Telecom was merging with Level 3, for example. Each of these companies had hundreds of certified professionals by MEF speaking the same language, at the time it was Ethernet, and also they had the service portfolios were all standardized. And they were able to say it was a much more seamless integration of those service portfolios, even though the networks may have been different. So that's the way we hopefully positively contribute.
It's funny, we had the conversation this morning about mergers and acquisitions and primarily consolidation. And the conversation was around, well, won't this make a great business case for an MBA class someday? And I said, yeah, I don't know that it's going to make a business class. It will probably make a psychology class.
Excellent. We've got a few minutes left, so I just wanted to also talk specifically about roaming, actually, as well. Alexandre, I know there's a lot of work going on the 4G roaming front at IBASIS at the moment. And obviously with IoT specifically, where do you see that developing? What are going to be the biggest things that come in the roaming world over the next 12 months, do you guys think?
The standardization of roaming is definitely, I think, a path to growth that is really a sure one. I mean, as maybe most of us know in this room, is that we are actually, today, we have half of our people in London for the Capacity Europe, and the other half in Valencia for the WAS, the roaming negotiation. And I think there, getting together the roamers with us capacity and get this international world standardized, that's where with 4G we can really have some very strong growth with added value, because of course, as we all know, it's very complicated to get all the standards speaking together, get maybe not as many members to MEF, but expert in belonging to you. And definitely, once you have that standardized, and that's what we are doing, you can serve the IoT field with much more accuracy. You can offer to non-telco players and not digital players, but semiconductors players, for instance, you can offer them an access worldwide to their products, a direct access with a very cheap connectivity.
One final point, if I may, and I'm going to go down the panel. Over the next couple of years for your organization, And again, I mentioned it earlier, Michael, with the NTT integration at the moment as well, so that's very interesting for your customers to hear. And also with the MEF event coming up as well, Kevin, about what to expect there. What is going to change within the next 12 months at your business? So if we're here again in 12 months' time, looking at the state of the industry and what's evolved and what's changed and what's been improved and what's, you know, the new area focused, what will that be 12 months from now?
My chairman would say 5G, proliferation of extended fiber and security. So I will say 5G, proliferation of fiber and security.
That's very good.
I think the reality, to tweak it just a bit to the small sliver of the company that I say grace over, there seems to be no end in sight as 5G, whether private 5G or public 5G, expands into the marketplace in the IoT riding that. There seems to be no end in sight for that. I would suspect that the most interesting panels next year, we will just be kind of at the, we'll be past the bleeding edge into the functional, probably the growth curve would be my guess this time next year.
Yeah, I think, so I would certainly jump onto the security, network security element of that, and I think that will continue to be a fairly significant thing for us for the next 12 months. For NTT specifically, and Jason, you've referenced it, but our integration with the 28 different companies, and that process just kind of really started over the last couple of months, and we have a long road ahead. I mean, I think that's pretty internal. I think from an external perspective, the hope certainly is that we, by combining the brands, combining the organizations, restructuring the business, do a better job of communicating our service portfolio and all those things to the marketplace. And so hopefully that's a benefit that we see 12 months from now that isn't quite in the place it should be today. And I think the other thing that we'll see is, I think you talk about IoT, I think even beyond just purely IoT as a generic category, but I think the applications that are being used to drive traffic and drive utilization of the network are continuing to change. I think whether you're talking about gaming, but I think there's a ton of applications around AR and VR that are really getting close to becoming significant. And the end user experience is getting to the point where it really is going to be something that goes beyond gaming, and actually there's going to be some, I think, business-to-business applications as well as business-to-consumer applications that really haven't taken hold yet. And I don't know if there'll be killer apps, but I think there'll be interesting apps or compelling apps, and I think that will drive usage in not just a pure volumetric way, but in how it actually can affect and kind of enhance, I guess, the utilization of the technologies that we offer. So those would be the things that I would kind of look to. A year may be a little ambitious for that last one, but I think it's certainly something that, you know, hopefully is a positive thing from a technology community perspective, and just, I guess, society in general. Those things should be really interesting. There's some great medical applications around some of the AR, VR stuff. I think it's going to be really cool when it really kind of gets done well.
Mm.
Yeah, in the next 12 months for us, we see a breakthrough in the monetization of IoT with the semiconductors partners. Typically what we have done with Nordic Semiconductors and others have done with other semiconductor partners. In the next 12 months, we will see business case monetizing IoT for our industry, of course, but not only, also for the Internet of Things industry.
There's a few things. Firstly, you know, the topic of inter-carrier automation, it's not going to go away. It's a lot of heavy lifting that's going to be going on for years, so it's not going to be the most exciting topic, but it's certainly going to be around 12 months from now. SD-WAN will, obviously, it's still in a fairly early stage, so you know, we're going to very much witness the transition from large enterprises building their own SD-WAN networks to buying managed services. But closely following the standardization work there, the hottest topic that we're seeing is security in that area. And MEF is very niche in its security work. We're doing security for SD-WAN. We've started that. That is the highest you know, area of demand, and we're not a general security player. You know, beyond that, one of the things we're doing with 5G is through the overall orchestration initiative is being able to provide this sort of framework for operators to incorporate 5G services as a service component, so maybe a last mile component, right? And again, that could be wholesale, mainly enterprise, but there could be wholesale and ramifications of that at some point in time. You might want to buy a wholesale 5G service to get last mile connectivity somewhere, right? So that's we'll see POCs around that kind of thing. And also there's an emergence of, this is getting more technical topics like intent-based network to simplify provisioning of services in a simplified abstract type way. So there'll be more discussion about that. The last one is edge, I think. I talked about the overlay and underlay thing, and we're just seeing more interest in understanding what the fabric, the transport environment of a provider is going to need to look like, how dynamic that's going to need to be to support edge. Where does 5G play? Where does SD-WAN play at the edge? What is the underlay going to have to do to support, dynamic cloud connectivity for edge? And so those are some of the messages you'll hear coming from us at we have an event coming up in a few weeks called MEF 19, and those are sort of the themes that we're putting out there.
Excellent. Okay, well, with that, I'd just like to say thank you very much to our panelists again. I'll hand over to my colleague Liz.